The palace at Palatine Hill was quiet. Outside, the faint rustling of palm leaves in the August night wind whispered across the marble courtyard. Torches flickered along the columns, and beyond the villa, Rome stretched out, dim, dusty, and just beginning to hush. But in the inner chambers of the palace, a single lantern remained lit. The emperor, Gaius Octavius, whom history knows as Augustus, did not sleep well. You wouldn't know it from the statues or coins. There, he is calm and composed, the first emperor of Rome, conqueror of chaos, master of order. But Augustus was not a man of restful nights. His bed was often abandoned after only a few hours. The palace servants, trained in discretion, would find his bedding neatly smoothed, the pages of scrolls turned, wax tablets used and set aside. Augustus battled what the ancients called the fretful spirit, a form of insomnia, not rare in Rome, but rarely recorded unless it afflicted someone of great importance. In the case of the emperor, his nightly routines became a matter of subtle record. The palace archivist mentioned in passing that Augustus often requested ledgers from the temple scribes at unusual hours. Even Suetonius, who reveled in personal detail, noted Augustus slept lightly and irregularly, never long in the same bed. But what did he do with his time, this sleepless ruler of the Roman world? Unlike modern minds that may scroll endlessly, Augustus turned to the old method of distraction, lists and letters. The emperor, by many accounts, preferred a quiet, dimly lit chamber. A single oil lantern, a cushion for his back, and a stack of scrolls, usually civic reports, lists of grain ships arriving from Alexandria, complaints from provincial governors, and temple restoration records. To many, this would seem unbearable. But Augustus did not find boredom unbearable. He found it comforting. Boredom meant order. Boredom meant the empire was functioning. Sometimes, he requested architectural blueprints. At other times, he had letters from magistrates in Hispania or Gaul read aloud. His freedman, Philo, who could read for hours without tiring, was often called in at midnight to recite petitions, legal summaries, or temple expenditure accounts. In those hours, Augustus wasn't simply managing the empire. He was taming the noise within. Roman beliefs about sleep were both medical and philosophical. Galen, the physician who came later, believed imbalances in the humors, especially black bile, could lead to wakefulness. But earlier philosophers, particularly Stoics, saw sleep as something to be used wisely, not indulged. Augustus aligned with this thinking. Though not a formal Stoic like Marcus Aurelius would become generations later, Augustus admired discipline, routine, and the illusion of control. And so, when he couldn't sleep, he did not toss and turn. He organized. He requested tax records from the provinces, especially from Egypt, whose papyri were famed for precision. It is not unlikely that Augustus reviewed documents like these by lamplight. He also oversaw temple renovations with meticulous care, and many decisions about which forgotten altars to restore were made during his nocturnal hours. A damaged inscription in the Temple of Saturn reads, "Restored by decree of the emperor at the third hour of night." Augustus was not just ruling during the day, he was ruling time itself. The room where Augustus passed his nights was not grand. In fact, he famously chose simplicity. The bed was modest, wooden, without gold or ivory inlay. The ceiling was low, the floors tiled in unadorned patterns. Curtains were linen, not silk. This was deliberate. The emperor once stated, "Too much comfort corrupts the mind," so he avoided it. An iron stand held the oil lamp, and beside it, a scroll case made of polished olive wood. On most nights, at least one scroll would be rolled out and weighed down with small stone weights to prevent it from curling. The night air was dry and cool. Through a small window slit in the stone, the faint sound of temple bells could be heard, used to mark the vigil hours of the watchmen on Rome's outer walls. Nearby, a wax tablet always sat ready. Augustus often made notes, many of which were later deciphered and copied into administrative ledgers. Notes like, "Recheck grain yield from Sicily," or "Priesthood succession," "Capitoline temple," "Speak to Agrippa." He did not waste time. Even in sleeplessness, he ruled. Augustus believed strongly in documentation. The Residential Gesti Divi Augusti, a document inscribed after his death, details all his achievements. But that grand list likely had its origins in the quiet midnight entries he made during his bouts of insomnia. The residential gesti speaks of cities founded, temples restored, wars won, gifts distributed to the people. But behind each bullet point lay nights of quiet review. Nights where Augustus, unable to sleep, read over population registers, construction budgets, and the census of Rome. The census was of particular importance to him. Conducted during his rule with greater accuracy than ever before, it sought to track the movements, taxes, and fates of Roman citizens. He insisted on updates from census officials every quarter. Some scholars believe these reports, often delayed by months, were summarized and read to him as he lay propped up on an elbow in his chamber. Did he find comfort in these scrolls? Perhaps. Routine in the night can feel like safety. In many ways, Augustus ruled differently at night. By day, he was the public face of Rome, the imperator, the son of the deified Julius, the patron of poets like Virgil. But by night, he was a clerk, a reader, a note-taker. This duality gave him a control few emperors matched. For while others reveled in spectacle, Augustus reveled in record-keeping. He once noted in a private letter to Tiberius that the weight of the empire is lighter when lifted one papyrus at a time. Such phrases would never be inscribed on stone monuments, but they reflect the man behind the myth. And so the nights passed, scroll by scroll, entry by entry, grain shipment by grain shipment. A quiet empire maintained by a sleepless mind. But was Augustus's midnight obsession with order a sign of strength, or of something else? Was the empire truly at peace, or was its ruler merely trying to drown out the sound of unrest, both within and without? The quiet hours deepened. A thin layer of dew collected on the marble thresholds of Palatine Hill. In the distance, the guards at the city gates rotated shifts, their sandals scuffing faintly across stone. Within the imperial chambers, the soft scratch of a stylus continued. Augustus, in his waking solitude, remained tethered to parchment and tablet. Where some emperors found their identity in military campaigns or political spectacle, Augustus located his power in minutiae. These sleepless rituals weren't a quirk, they were governance. Yet this section of his life rarely appears in classroom history books or dramatic retellings. The real empire, after all, wasn't sustained on battlefields alone. It was sustained in rooms like this, by rulers who counted amphorae of grain and recalculated regional levies while the rest of the empire slept. When Augustus emerged victorious from the civil wars, he didn't immediately crown himself emperor. He treaded carefully. The memory of Caesar's assassination hung over Rome like a smoke cloud. Augustus, still Octavian then, spent years maneuvering, quietly accumulating titles, quietly reforming. His powers were granted piecemeal. Tribune, consul, princeps. But with each title came responsibility, and with responsibility came restlessness. The Pax Romana, Rome's celebrated peace, was no natural occurrence. It was enforced through endless compromise, detail management, and bureaucratic coordination. Augustus understood this, and so, his insomnia became not a flaw, but a feature of his rule. Reports arrived daily, but only at night could he review them uninterrupted. The quiet allowed focus. In these hours, he reviewed temple expenditures from regions like Bithynia and Numidia, adjusted tax leniencies in grain-starved provinces, and requested census corrections for towns that had sent conflicting population numbers. We know this because the letters and decrees he issued after his night reviews were time-stamped unusually early. Some bore dawn seals, suggesting they were written before the scribes even began their day. Even the grand monuments Rome celebrated, like the Era Pacis or the Forum of Augustus, were micromanaged by him in darkness. He once overruled a stonecutter's design on a frieze depicting the goddess Roma, because the iconography was too martial for a monument of peace. He noticed everything, even in the dark. Of course, Augustus wasn't entirely alone. An emperor requires instruments. And for a sleepless ruler, those instruments had to function at odd hours. Among them was Scribonius, a scribe whose name appears on marginal notes across several early imperial edicts. A man of routine and almost unnatural patience, Scribonius specialized in data cross-referencing. If conflicting records arose from different governors, he annotated the margins with comparison notes. He was available at any hour. not because he was commanded to be, but because he, too, was a man of quiet obsession. He kept a portable desk in the corner of the emperor's reading chamber, a box of styluses arranged by wax texture, and always an extra lamp wick. Then there were the couriers, runners of the cursus publicus, Rome's state-run postal system. These men were used to odd departures, but Augustus's late-night messages required even stricter discretion. A policy was established. Messages sent between midnight and dawn had to be sealed with a unique lacquer blend, a shade of blue-black found only in one region of Latium. These nighttime runners were lightly armored, quiet, and often barefoot to prevent echo in the palace halls. They carried reports between senators, generals, and administrators long before the sun rose. One such runner, Gaius Crispus, documented his delivery logs meticulously. Found centuries later in an ossuary inscription, his record included phrases like, "Delivered scroll to governor of Pannonia. Departed at second hour of night. Returned without rest." This silent infrastructure supported the emperor's late-night regime. Most people remember Augustus for ending the civil wars, founding the empire, or supporting poets like Virgil and Horace. But few reflect on his lesser-known achievements, accomplishments born not from drama, but from painstaking organization. Among them, standardizing provincial tax brackets, a multi-year project involving hundreds of scrolls and ongoing updates, many of which were discussed with Augustus during the night. The brackets took into account not just land productivity, but transportation costs and local religious exemptions. Veteran resettlement accounting. After the chaos of war, thousands of legionaries required land grants. Augustus created a rolling resettlement schedule, using former colonies as staging grounds. Night reports from regional planners helped him avoid overburdening any single province. Calendar corrections. Though Julius Caesar had implemented the Julian calendar, administrative discrepancies remained. Augustus oversaw calendar standardization throughout Italy and into Gaul, catching inconsistencies in festival dates and court hearings, often noted during his nocturnal readings. Temple inventories. Augustus commissioned the first comprehensive inventory of temple goods in Rome. Gold candelabras, ritual bowls, priestly robes, each item recorded. And yet, the records suggest it was the emperor himself who resolved disputes in the tallies. Why? Because only he read the reports in full. These weren't glamorous projects, but they were the veins through which imperial Rome's heart beat. It's worth noting that Augustus was not entirely removed from family life. He had a wife, Livia Drusilla, a woman of strong will and famously strategic mind. Livia, unlike Augustus, slept soundly and efficiently. She encouraged his night reviews, but rarely joined them. Once, in a rare surviving personal note, Augustus wrote, "Livia dreams peacefully. I envy her, but I find the empire more manageable in ink than in dreams." Their chambers were adjacent, and the soft clink of tablets or scrolls unrolling was so common that Livia reportedly stopped noticing it. There were other figures, too. Tiberius, his reluctant heir, who found his adoptive father's routine stifling. Agrippa, the loyal general and planner, whose logistical mind complemented Augustus's own. But none of them matched his appetite for nocturnal detail. In truth, his sleeplessness isolated him, not emotionally, but temporally. He lived on a different rhythm than even those closest to him. There's something haunting about Augustus's habits, not because they were manic or dysfunctional, but because they were so utterly deliberate. Sleep is usually where power loses its grip, where even emperors become vulnerable. Yet Augustus never quite surrendered to it. He dozed, he napped, but rarely surrendered. What does it mean when the leader of the world's greatest empire spends his hours checking numbers no one else reads? When he knows the grain shipment counts from Africa better than the provincial governors themselves? Did Augustus fear disorder more than fatigue? Did he sense that the empire, though triumphant, teetered always at the edge of mismanagement? His nightly routines suggest a man who saw chaos not in revolts or invasions, but in misfiled records, undelivered scrolls, and unread updates. This obsession would carry into his final years. But how did this sleepless dedication change Augustus and Rome itself? What happens when an empire becomes so bound to the waking mind of one man that his habits, fears, and fatigue shape the entire machinery of government? The last years of Augustus's life unfolded not in the glory of conquest or fanfare of triumphal marches, but in repetition. Scrolls still arrived at dusk. Letters still required review. His insomnia, now aged into ritual, governed not only his nights but the tempo of his final decade. To the city, he remained its serene princeps, the first citizen. To history, he would be memorialized in triumph. But within the shadowed palace corridors, a quieter truth lingered. Augustus was a man sustained by the machinery of lists, lulled by the soft rustle of parchment, and endlessly caught in the looping rhythm of control. Let us now follow him into those final nights, where the empire's order was preserved not by swords or laws, but by candlelight, wax tablets, and a tired, watchful mind. In the year 14 CE, Augustus, then in his 76th year, began dictating the final version of his residential Gesti Divi Augusti, the personal account of his public achievements. Though many assumed it had been slowly compiled over decades, several scholars believe the final edits were completed during a particularly sleepless stretch in the summer months of his last year. He did not write it as propaganda, at least not in the way we understand the word now. For Augustus, it was a record, a final, dutiful summation of his endless administration. The original bronze inscription, eventually mounted outside his mausoleum, was likely copied from wax tablets Augustus reviewed nightly. Surviving fragments describe how he made marginal notes late into the evening, under lamplight. Some corrections reference minutiae, missed line counts, duplicate phrasing, outdated names of magistrates. He was correcting himself even in legacy. The final text doesn't speak of his inner life. There are no reflections on love, friendship, or regret. There is no mention of insomnia or the long nights spent parsing census tallies. Instead, it lists endowments, treaties, colonies founded, games given, taxes levied and forgiven. But behind every entry, one can almost hear the dry whisper of scrolls being turned at 2 a.m. Augustus's administrative model worked not because it was revolutionary, but because he paid attention. The Republic had faltered due to chaos, ambition unchecked, records ignored, governors acting beyond mandate. Augustus chose a quieter tyranny, rule by competence. In his final years, he no longer needed to check every shipment manifest from Alexandria. But he did. Not out of distrust, but because his comfort now required consistency. He had trained his mind not to rest unless it rested on detail. He once remarked to a visiting senator, "I do not trust luck to preserve what laziness forgets." Indeed, laziness was his greatest enemy. By now, even his household had adjusted completely to his habits. Servants walked softly at night. Scribes maintained alternate shifts. Library scrolls were categorized not only by topic, but by hour of expected use. Tiberius, his designated heir, grew increasingly frustrated with this model of leadership. He found his adoptive father's micromanagement stifling. Where Augustus reviewed grain tallies at night, Tiberius preferred to delegate. The two disagreed quietly, but fundamentally. And so, in the end, Augustus's true legacy was not simply an empire. It was a culture of administrative continuity, a state maintained by scribes, ledgers, temple inventories, and meticulously updated decrees. After his death, the imperial bureaucracy, first modeled after his nightly routines, expanded. Later emperors abandoned many of Augustus's personal values, but they could not undo the system he had normalized. The empire no longer needed a senate to function. It needed clerks. On his last night in Nola, far from Rome, Augustus lay in a modest villa once owned by his father. According to Tacitus and Suetonius, he drifted in and out of consciousness. Livia sat nearby, holding his hand. He reportedly asked for a report on a nearby aqueduct project, delayed due to poor cement quality. It's possible he never heard the answer. There are no scrolls from that night, no tablet records. But we do know that, until shortly before his final illness, he continued to issue administrative notes. One entry, dictated only weeks earlier, read, "Recheck the temple census in Capua. Figures differ from last quarter." Even in decline, his mind lingered on balance. With Augustus's passing, Rome entered a new phase, no longer a republic in transition, but a full autocracy in all but name. Tiberius took control, less enamored with record-keeping, more focused on power. The scribes who had once organized nightly scroll readings were reassigned or dismissed. Some became librarians. Others, like Scribonius, disappeared into history. But the rhythm Augustus had established, the deep infrastructure of bureaucracy, persisted. The imperial postal routes, the standardized temple records, the census protocols, these carried forward for centuries. Even emperors like Hadrian and Antoninus Pius later referred to Augustan methods when reviewing provincial finances. The man who couldn't sleep had given Rome a system that refused to rest. In the end, Augustus's legacy was as much inertia as it was empire. His insomnia became a kind of engine, powering an entire government beneath the veil of darkness. His obsession with scrolls, numbers, and records, the boring, daily grind of administration, sustained an empire for generations. He showed that the fate of millions could rest not on heroic battles, but on who remembered to file the right census on time, who checked the balance of grain stores before the flood, who read one more page before sleeping. And perhaps, in the quiet hours of your own sleepless nights, you can hear it too, the faint rustle of ancient parchment, the soft click of a stylus, the gentle heartbeat of a civilization held together by routine. The wind that rolled over the moors was sharp, cold, wet, and constant. The kind of wind that crept into joints and lingered in bones, not with fury, but with the slow persistence of time itself. And there, stretching across the hills like a ribbon of silent resistance, stood the stones, Hadrian's Wall. You've likely heard of it, a defensive barrier built by the Romans in the 2nd century AD to mark the northernmost edge of their empire in Britannia. It runs nearly 80 Roman miles, from the River Tyne in the east to the Solway Firth in the west. But what you may not have heard about, what history usually overlooks, are the forgotten men who lived on it, guarded it, and endured its emptiness. This is not the story of Emperor Hadrian, though his name graces the monument. It is not a tale of conquest or victory. It is the quieter, lonelier story of the watchman, of what it meant to stand on a wall built to keep the world out, night after night, in the fog, in the rain, in the silence. By the time construction began in AD 122, Britannia had long been a troubled province, not due to full-scale wars, but because of the constant thrum of instability, raids, tax resistance, cultural divide. Hadrian, unlike many of his imperial predecessors, was not a conqueror by nature. He was an organizer. His wall wasn't built as a monument to expansion. It was built to draw a line, but not just a line in the earth, a line in the mind. For the Romans, the wall signified the boundary of civitas, civilization. Beyond it lay the ungovernable north, Caledonia, a land of tribes with no cities, no Latin script, and no desire to bend. Hadrian's logic was simple. If it could not be pacified, it could be walled off. Construction began in earnest using 3 legions, roughly 15,000 men. They worked fast. The wall was made of stone in the east, turf in the west, and spanned rivers, valleys, and steep crags. Along its length were mile castles every Roman mile, and 2 smaller watchtowers in between. Atop these, the forgotten watchmen took their posts. Imagine you were one of them. Perhaps you were born in Germania, conscripted into a Roman auxiliary cohort, non-citizen soldiers who earned their rights through service. You were transported across the sea to this damp, gray island, and now you stand on a stone platform in a tower no wider than a cottage, overlooking a land that never seems to dry. You are not a hero. You are not rich. You are not remembered. But you are essential. Your day begins in the half-light before dawn. The watch changes slow. You descend the narrow stair from the tower and nod to the next man. There are 4 of you on this post, rotating shifts. Someone boils oats, someone oils weapons, someone sleeps. One always watches. What do you see? Usually nothing. Sometimes, smoke from a distant settlement. A deer crossing the heather. A bird nesting on the battlements. Occasionally, movement in the trees. But more often than not, it's fog. Dense, wet fog, wrapping the land and wall like a burial shroud. Your job is not to fight, but to see. Or try to. In the tower is a bronze bell, rung not an alarm, but to mark shifts. The only sound for miles. You strike it softly. Once. Twice. Then sit again. This goes on for weeks. Each watchtower had basic provisions. a fire pit for heat, an amphora or two of dried rations, a cache of grain kept sealed in waxed sacks, oil lamps, and woolen cloaks. Supplies were delivered by pack mule once every 10 days, weather permitting. If the trail was blocked by snow or flood, the delivery could be delayed. When that happened, the men resorted to local forage, roots, moss, wild leeks. One recovered military tablet from Vindolanda, a nearby Roman fort just south of the wall. Notes: rations thinned. Will petition for dried legumes next dispatch. Mules lost near the East Bridge. Suspect collapse from rot. Comfort was not a consideration. The men were paid in salt, coin, and eventually Roman citizenship. But day to day, they subsisted on a repetitive diet of porridge and salted meats. Spoons were carved from bone, cups made of clay. Fires were rationed. You couldn't afford to attract attention at night. How did the wall communicate? Signal fires. Each mile castle had a beacon tower. When lit, the light could be seen from the next in line, if the air was clear. But it rarely was. So, secondary systems developed. Horns, flags, messages on wax tablets carried by runners. These messages were rarely urgent. More often, they contained the mundane details of life at the empire's edge. Goats escaped pen. Request rope and herders. Watchtower 23 reports lice infestation. Request new tunics. Storm damage to parapet. Stones loose. Recommend repairs before first frost. Over 800 writing tablets have been unearthed from Vindolanda alone. They are dull, repetitive, beautiful, because they prove the wall was not just a structure, but a living, boring organism. A network of complaints, requests, and updates sent between stone boxes in the wilderness. Contrary to popular belief, Hadrian's Wall was not manned entirely by Roman-born citizens. Most of the men stationed there were auxiliaries, recruited from far-flung parts of the empire. There were Dacians from modern-day Romania, Syrians unaccustomed to rain, Spaniards who had never seen snow. One cohort stationed at the fort of Karaburg was composed of Tungrians from what is now Belgium. They brought their gods with them, shrines to Mithras, offerings to river spirits. One tablet lists the names of men who made sacrifices for health, not to Mars, but to obscure household deities no longer known to history. What did they talk about? Home, food, memory. A preserved letter from a commander's wife, written in Latin but in the clumsy hand of a scribe, invites another officer's wife to a birthday dinner at the fort. It's the oldest known letter in a woman's hand from Roman Britain. The invitation is casual, the writing uneven, the meal likely humble. But it tells us that even here, on the edge of empire, life persisted in small, forgettable moments. We often assume borders are loud, sites of conflict. But Hadrian's Wall was more often quiet than violent. The silence was strategic. The wall discouraged rather than engaged. It slowed rather than stopped. The tribes of the north, the Votadini, Selgovi, and others, could still move through under permit. There was trade, some intermarriage, occasional skirmishes. But mostly, routine. Patrols, watches, ration checks, wall repairs. A wooden stylus tablet from the fort at Burdoswald reads, "Oil low, cold worsening. Replace boots. Rain again." That was life at the wall. It was not glamorous. It was not glorious. But it was history. So what kept these men there? Was it duty? Fear? The promise of citizenship? Or had they, over time, simply forgotten what it meant to live anywhere else? Dawn does not break cleanly over the Roman frontier. Instead, it bleeds through layers of mist, diffusing across moor and fun. The watchman on Tower 39 blinks against the haze, wraps his woolen cloak tighter, and watches the slow shift of shadow to gray. The change is subtle. The hours blur. He scratches his report into a wax tablet. Half ritual, half record-keeping. Fog remains. Visibility low. No movement. Firewood diminishing. Somewhere eastward, another man notes the same. To the south, a scribe logs the delivery of olive oil, which arrived partly spoiled. The oil had traveled months from Hispania to reach this outpost, only to sour before it could be used. That, too, is written down. This is the life the empire demanded, a life recorded in mundane detail, preserved in quiet, lived in anticipation of little. And yet, these men endured. Hadrian's Wall wasn't a single structure, it was a system. Behind the wall, at regular intervals, stood forts, larger, more developed settlements that housed anywhere from 500 to 1,000 soldiers, administrators, merchants, and families. Forts like Vindolanda, housesteads, and Chesters functioned as local administrative hubs. They contained granaries, elevated to protect against rats and damp, bathhouses warmed by hypocaust systems, underground furnaces fed by constant fuel, barracks packed and communal, shrines where offerings to Roman and local gods coexisted. These were not cities. They were outposts, but to the watchmen, they were civilization. Between their distant towers and the fortified walls of the forts ran paths, stone tracks, and often just well-worn mud trails. Messages, rations, orders, all passed between tower and fort with rhythmic monotony. Some watchmen rotated between duty on the wall and time inside a fort, though many remained in towers for months, if not years. At Vindolanda, archaeologists uncovered a treasure that sheds light on the daily minds of Rome's forgotten men: hundreds of wooden writing tablets, preserved in the waterlogged soil. These tablets are not declarations of war or sweeping speeches. They are inventory lists: 12 cloaks, 3 worn, 8 boots needing stitching, 24 spears inspected. Personal notes: I have sent you socks, 2 pairs of sandals, and underpants. Goodbye, my sister. Petitions to superiors: the men complain the beer is of poor quality. Request to replace the brewer. One particularly well-preserved tablet captures a soldier requesting more writing supplies. I am sending you a pen and 2 combs. Greet my brother. Send more ink if possible. The last shipment was thin. Ink, combs, underpants. This is what life looked like on the edge of empire. Even in isolation, the watchmen were not irreligious. In fact, spiritual life may have deepened in the bleakness. Shrines have been uncovered in towers, simple altars to Mithras, Jupiter Dolichinas, and local deities never recorded in central Roman worship. In Karaburg, a Mithraeum, a temple dedicated to Mithras, the god of light and oaths, was dug into the earth. Torchlight would have flickered across rough-hewn stone as initiates whispered vows in the cold dark. Mithras, often favored by soldiers, represented order amidst chaos. His cult ceremonies emphasized light in darkness, a metaphor not lost on men stationed in fog, far from home. Some watchmen carried personal charms: bits of carved bone, smooth stones from home rivers, inscriptions on belt buckles or helmet linings. One graffito reads, "Maro slept here. He served with loyalty. May Fortuna guide his hand." Carved not in stone, but in the softer interior of a tower wall, likely with a nail. We imagine the northern tribes, Caledonians, Brigantes, Votadini, as enemies. And sometimes they were, but the reality was more porous. There was trade, pelts, honey, livestock, and there were relationships. Some watchmen had children with local women. Others may have adopted northern ways of hunting or herb lore. Cultural boundaries blurred, especially when contact was consistent but conflict was not. The wall, for all its stone, was not impermeable. Permits were issued for traders to cross into Roman lands. Inscriptions from fort records reference authorized movement of 9 goats and a mule across the northern gate. This gate had a name, Porta Decumana, and yes, even it had a guard rotation schedule. Sometimes tribes raided. Sometimes Roman soldiers stole. Both sides accused the other. But mostly, things stayed the same. The wall held. Not through power, but through predictability. If the wall had an enemy more relentless than the tribes, it was weather. The men of Rome, especially those from sun-drenched provinces, were not prepared for Britannia's gray relentlessness. Snow pressed into stone, widened cracks, loosened foundations. Fog made signals difficult. Rain turned tracks to sludge. Wind howled in the cracks between bricks, moaning like voices in the night. Repair was constant and dull. An internal memo from housesteads recorded: parapet slumped near eastern turret. Requested 8 more men. Stones shifting. Imagine trying to mix mortar in sleet. Or replacing wall segments during freezing rain. These men weren't warriors. They were masons, builders, and janitors of an empire's extremity. One soldier wrote, with grim humor, The north wind blows harder than any enemy. And then requested another cloak. Perhaps the most remarkable fact about the wall is this. It was administered with care. Scrolls tracked grain allotments. Logs detailed arrowhead usage. A scribe recorded when the bathhouse's roof tiles were repaired. Everything had a form, a stamp, a countersignature. This wasn't just discipline. It was a cultural belief. Order defined civilization. Even if no battle came. Even if the wall outlived its necessity. Even if no one ever read the reports again. The watchmen kept recording. Because Rome taught them that even boredom must be preserved. But what happens to a man whose entire life is reduced to reports and routine? When every day is the same fog, the same wall, the same scrolls, does duty become identity? Or does something quieter begin to fade? The rain came again at dusk. Not a storm, not a flood, just the persistent, thin mist that soaked tunics and curled the edges of wax tablets. A watchman on Tower 54 scratched at his damp beard and looked east. No signal fires. No movement. He marked the hour with a line in the ledger, then turned back toward the hearth to tend a flickering ember. Such was the life of those who manned Hadrian's Wall. We speak of empires in terms of conquests and emperors. But here, on this edge of the Roman world, the empire lived in the form of routine, in quiet men with dull tasks, in worn boots and cracked mortar. These were the watchmen, the ones who did not make history, but upheld it, one fog-bound shift at a time. Many of the wall's soldiers were not young conscripts passing through. They were career men, veterans of 2 decades or more. When their 25 years of service concluded, they were granted citizenship and a modest pension. Some left. Many stayed. Veterans often settled nearby, forming vicus communities just outside the walls of major forts. These were small, informal villages, clusters of huts and workshops. Wives, children, merchants, and former soldiers lived there, creating a hybrid society, part Roman, part native. A few became civil administrators, continuing their habits of record-keeping and maintenance. Others turned to farming. Some opened taverns for the younger troops, but many simply stayed because they could not imagine life elsewhere. The wall had become not just their duty, but their identity. Unlike emperors or generals, these men left no statues. No grand epitaphs, but they did leave marks. On a discarded piece of leather near Vindolanda, archaeologists found a child's shoe, less than 20 centimeters long. It was carefully made, patterned with punched designs, and stitched from local materials. Someone had taken the time to craft a good pair of shoes for a small foot in a cold climate. There are thousands of such objects: brooches, spindle whorls, broken dice, ink pots, and bone hairpins, scattered across the fort sites. Their preservation tells us not just that soldiers lived here, but that they lived human lives, messy, mundane, and beautifully repetitive. In Tower 34, someone carved a tic-tac-toe grid into the stone windowsill. Perhaps 2 guards played during a long watch. Perhaps no one ever won. As the decades wore on, the wall remained, but the empire changed. By the 3rd century, political instability in Rome accelerated. Emperors rose and fell in rapid succession. Funding and logistics for far-flung provinces faltered. Garrisons went unpaid. Supply chains broke down. And yet, Hadrian's Wall held. Not with the same perfection as before. Stones fell. Some towers went unmanned. But enough men remained, still writing their reports, still watching the line, still lighting signal fires. Rome stopped paying attention, but the wall didn't. And then, in the early 5th century, Rome began its retreat. Troops were recalled. Garrisons downsized. The Western Empire teetered under pressure from within and without. Hadrian's Wall was not abandoned all at once. It faded. One tower went quiet. Then another. The forts remained for a time, slowly emptying. The stone was sometimes reused by locals. Other times, it simply weathered away. But for years, perhaps decades, some watchmen stayed. Not because they had orders, but because routine outlasts empire. There's no record of the last signal fire on Hadrian's Wall. No date for the final shift change or the last ration ledger. But somewhere, perhaps around AD 410, a man on a lonely tower stepped down from his post for the last time. No replacement came. The scrolls stopped arriving. The path grew wild. Did he feel relief? Or loss? Did he carry his armor with him, or bury it by the hearth? No one knows. But long after the soldiers left, the wall itself remained, its stones heavy with memory, silent under centuries of grass, moss, and wind. Today, Hadrian's Wall is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Tourists walk its length in summer, guided by plaques and signs. But the real story of the wall is harder to see. It is in the invisible hands that built it, in the men who carried mortar, sharpened spears, stirred porridge, patched tunics, and kept journals no one would read. It is in the recorded tedium, the careful notations of oil shortages, livestock counts, and lice infestations. These men were never celebrated. Most were never even named. Yet they held one of the largest empires in history at its edge for nearly 3 centuries. And they did it not with glory, but with persistence. Empires often fall with drama, but they endure through maintenance. Hadrian's Wall teaches us that history is not built only by leaders, but by the quiet diligence of ordinary people. People who stay at their posts, who light the fires, who write the reports, who count the grain, who wait. And perhaps, in your own life, you felt that same pull of duty without recognition, of routines that seem to go unnoticed. But remember, even forgotten watchmen can shape the course of history. The marble tiles were always warm, not hot, just warm enough to coax tension from joints and silence from the tongue. Light filtered through thin, high windows, falling in long golden lines onto stone benches. The air shimmered with heat. Every breath tasted faintly of steam, oil, and mineral water. This was the bathhouse. Not just any Roman bathhouse, and not one open to the masses, but the private balneum attached to the imperial villa on the Celian Hill. It was here, almost every day, that Marcus Aurelius, emperor, stoic philosopher, reluctant ruler, began his mornings. To the outside world, Marcus was emperor of Rome at its height, a man with armies, riches, philosophers, and scribes at his command. But to those closest to him, he was a man of routine. A man who found comfort not in spectacle, but in repetition, especially in the bath. And this story is not about the meditations he wrote, or the wars he fought, but the rituals he kept, the warm water, the quiet rooms, and the slow, daily rhythm of cleansing both body and mind. Before the sun had fully risen, the palace began to stir. Marcus Aurelius rose early, often just after the 4th hour of the night, and spent the earliest part of the morning writing. He wrote in Greek, not Latin. His philosophical journals, later known as meditations, were private exercises never intended for publication. Written in a careful, clear hand, they reflected his effort to live deliberately, thoughtfully, without self-deception. When you wake up in the morning, tell yourself, the people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant. So began one entry. Not a complaint, but a preparation. His day was not shaped by comfort. It was shaped by discipline. And once the writing was done, he turned to the bath. His procession was small, 2 servants, a physician, and a young freedman named Diogenes who carried his oils and sandals. The group moved quietly. The emperor disliked noise. Marcus's personal bathhouse followed the standard Roman format, though modestly scaled: a potatorium, the changing room tepidarium, the warm room caldarium, the hot room with the bath frigidarium, the cold plunge palestra, a small courtyard for light stretching or exercise. The floors were lined with mosaics, geometric patterns, not elaborate scenes. The walls bore faint murals of nature, fig trees, laurel, doves. The colors were soft. Nothing in the space demanded attention. It was designed for reflection, not indulgence. Beneath the floors, the hypocaust system glowed, a network of heated air passages fed by furnaces stoked by laborers before dawn. You could hear them faintly, their movements echoing under the stone. The temperature of each room was carefully maintained. Marcus insisted on balance, no extremes. The physician, Galen, yes, the very same Galen whose medical texts would dominate for centuries, monitored the steam and temperature. He kept a record of each bath's warmth and humidity, noting which treatments calmed Marcus's chronic stomach pains, which aggravated his insomnia. One surviving note from Galen's scrolls reads, "The emperor prefers 2 turns in the tepidarium. Avoids prolonged exposure in the caldarium, aggravates the pulse." Once undressed, Marcus began the routine. First, oil. Olive oil infused with lavender or myrtle was applied to the skin. Not a luxury, but a functional cleanser. Soap was rare in Roman bathing. Oil, when scraped off, took dirt with it. Then, the strigil. A curved metal tool, held gently, and used to scrape away oil and sweat. Slaves performed this task, but under Marcus's instruction, it was done slowly, methodically. He rarely spoke during this time. He preferred silence, or sometimes quiet recitations from Epictetus, the Stoic whose teachings had most influenced his youth. Don't explain your philosophy. Embody it. That was a line he repeated often. For Marcus, the bath was more than hygiene. It was a philosophical exercise, a return to what he called the nature of things. Surrounded by steam and heat, without armor or imperial dress, he could think freely. Sometimes he quoted Heraclitus, "You cannot step into the same river twice." Other times, he simply breathed. The hot room, caldarium, was where the tension finally eased. He sat on a stone bench near the curved wall, watching steam rise. This was where he processed the day ahead. Not decisions, those came later. Here he simply thought. About duty, mortality, order. He once wrote, "Consider how many doctors have died after furrowing their brows over the sick. How many philosophers after endless disputation. How many great commanders after shedding blood. All alike in the grave." Such thoughts, grim to some, comforted him. They reminded him that even emperors dissolve. After the bath, he would sometimes step into the palestra, the open-air courtyard, to stretch and breathe fresh air. He disliked vigorous exercise, unlike his predecessor Hadrian. But he believed in motion. Under Galen's guidance, he walked in circles or practiced slow arm rotations to loosen his joints. The body, he believed, was a vessel. It must be maintained, but not obsessed over. There were no crowds, no chariot races, just stone, sky, and the rhythm of breath. By the time Marcus returned to his dressing chamber, the sun had risen fully. The city was stirring. Messengers awaited. Petitions were piling. Senators would soon arrive for audiences. There were letters from generals on the Danube frontier, reports of flooding in Hispania, a potential grain shortage in Egypt. But Marcus was ready. The bathhouse had done its job. It had reset him. He dressed in a simple tunic, a woolen cloak if the morning was cold, and ate a modest breakfast, usually barley gruel with a touch of honey. Then he began his day. By the time Marcus returned to his dressing chamber, the sun had risen fully. The city was stirring. Messengers awaited. Petitions were piling. Senators would soon arrive for audiences. There were letters from generals on the Danube frontier, reports of flooding in Hispania, a potential grain shortage in Egypt. But Marcus was ready. The bathhouse had done its job. It had reset him. He dressed in a simple tunic, a woolen cloak if the morning was cold, and ate a modest breakfast, usually barley gruel with a touch of honey. Then he began his day. But how long can a man, any man, sustain such balance? Can philosophy hold its shape when the world begins to unravel around it? When war calls, when plague arrives, when grief enters the chamber. The heat still rose from the caldarium floor. The soft patter of water against stone still echoed through the arched ceilings. Oil still glistened faintly on bronze strigils lined on the shelf. But the air felt heavier now, thicker, more uncertain. Marcus Aurelius still entered the bathhouse each morning, still followed his practiced ritual. But the world outside the warm walls was changing, and fast. This section is not about the bathhouse as a sanctuary. It is about what happens when the ritual persists, even as everything else begins to fall apart. It arrived quietly. Some said it was carried back by troops returning from the east. Others claimed it spread through merchant routes, hidden in cloth shipments and caravan breath. By the late 160 CE, the Antonine plague, likely smallpox, was seeping through the empire, and it reached the capital. Thousands died, then tens of thousands. The records grow vague. In Rome, crematoria overflowed. Temples reopened for forgotten gods. Physicians, priests, and soothsayers made predictions and offerings in equal measure. Panic swelled in the streets like floodwater. But Marcus Aurelius still bathed. He altered his routine. His physician Galen was dispatched to study the plague firsthand. His attendance at public gatherings waned. But his private discipline remained. The bathhouse, though more somber now, was still visited. Begin each day by reminding yourself what is within your control, he wrote. Not life, not death, but conduct. That is yours. He shortened his time in the caldarium, preferring the tepidarium. The air was safer there, Galen believed. He requested the firewood be dried longer to avoid smoke. Even the oils were reformulated, cedar and vinegar now mixed in, believed to purify the humors. The strigils were cleaned twice per use. At the same time, news from the northern frontier turned grim. The Marcomannic Wars had erupted. Germanic tribes were moving across the Danube. Roman forts were burned, villages abandoned, and Roman citizens slaughtered in Pannonia and Noricum. Marcus's co-emperor and adoptive brother, Lucius Verus, was already in the field. He sent dispatches by fast courier. Marcus read them in the frigidarium, cooling his skin and absorbing bad news in silence. He didn't rush to respond, not out of negligence, but because he believed even catastrophe must be faced with calm. Do not be daunted by appearances. Events are not against you. They are indifferent. It is you who must not be indifferent in return. Still, the rhythm of the empire trembled. He began shortening his time in the bathhouse. The rituals remained, but they tightened. The silk towel replaced with wool. The perfumes removed. The bench where he once rested after steam now stayed empty. He no longer stretched in the palestra. The plague didn't spare the palace. At least one of Marcus's sons, likely Lucius the Younger, died during the outbreak. It's unclear when. The records are thin, and Marcus himself does not write about it directly in the Meditations. But his tone shifts, from hope to acceptance, from philosophical inquiry to stoic endurance. You may leave this life today. Let that determine what you do, say, and think. Even in the bathhouse, servants now wore cloth around their faces. Steam no longer smelled of lavender. The air was scented with disinfectants, boiled vinegar, and bitter herbs. Still he bathed, because ritual was resistance. To break the habit would be to surrender to chaos. Marcus knew this, and so he clung to his repetitions, as though they were the last stones of a crumbling wall. The bathhouse had mirrors, polished bronze, not glass. Marcus used them only occasionally, but during this time, it said he would sometimes sit alone after the bath, staring at the water's surface. Not to admire himself, but to consider impermanence. In the changing light, steam would drift across the surface, breaking his reflection into fragments. How ridiculous and how strange, he wrote, to be surprised at anything which happens in life. To him, the bath itself became a metaphor. The water is clear, then ripples. The heat comforts, then fades. The routine remains, until it doesn't. These thoughts did not depress him. They anchored him. After the bath, Marcus still dressed plainly. He would return to the audience chamber, hear reports of cities begging for grain, of soldiers requesting reinforcements, of temples asking for imperial donations to fund new rituals for healing. And he listened. He replied. He ruled. But it was in the bathhouse, before the public face was worn, that he processed. Quietly, without interruption, without noise. Even as plague, war, and grief pressed in. Everything is ephemeral, he wrote. Fame and memory alike. Dust, ash. A moment. That moment, however brief, was protected in steam. In later years, while on campaign, Marcus had a mobile bath constructed, a tinted enclosure with a small brazier, hot stones, and a copper basin. Even on the Danube, amid army camps and snow, he preserved a version of his practice. It was not indulgent. It was survival. Just as soldiers oiled their armor and sharpened swords, Marcus tended to his mind, not in decadence, but in discipline. His generals observed this habit with curiosity, his son Commodus with impatience. But Marcus never explained it, because it didn't need explaining. What is left of a man when even his empire begins to crumble? If all that remains is ritual, are those motions enough to hold a mind together? The bathhouse had changed. Gone were the polished oil jars, the measured scraping of strigils, the steady rhythm of steam. In their place, quiet decay, moss on corners, cracks in the marble, dull echoes in empty halls. Marcus Aurelius no longer bathed in the Celian Hill villa. He had not seen Rome in years. Instead, he washed his hands and face from a brass basin in a cold military tent pitched near the Danube River. on the outer edge of empire. The bath had become a memory, a ghost of heat and calm. Yet even here, surrounded by war, frost, and the burden of rule, he preserved its essence. Because Marcus understood what so few leaders ever do. When the world breaks, the only thing left is how you hold yourself together. By the late 170 CE, Marcus Aurelius was far from home. The Marcomannic Wars had dragged on for years. Tribes across Germania and beyond had allied, swept across Roman borders, and burned entire provinces. Rome, caught off guard by the sheer coordination of these tribal forces, responded slowly. Too slowly. Marcus, now in his late 50s, took personal command of the frontier. He left behind the marble of Rome for mud, snow, and canvas tents. He slept in army cots, ate from common rations, and rose before dawn. There were no bathhouses on the front, but he made do. Galen, or perhaps one of his successors, constructed for the emperor a portable bathing tent, a modest contraption with heated stones, a raised wooden floor, and a canvas roof reinforced with animal hide. Every third or fourth day, Marcus would retreat there, usually alone or with one attendant. The brazier would be lit, water poured over hot rocks. The steam would rise, less fragrant than before, tinged with the scent of pine and wool, but still enough to warm the bones. This was no indulgence. This was survival. Even at the edge of the empire, surrounded by death and uncertainty, Marcus preserved the structure of thought that the bathhouse once gave him. The soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts, he wrote during this campaign. So be careful what you think. Though many of his writings were lost to time, fragments remain, scribbled notes, observations, orders. Some found in the margins of army manifests, some preserved in copies of meditations. One line, written on a wax tablet from this period: "No bath today. Fire would not light. Hands numb." Wrote anyway. He had become what the Stoics had always taught, independent of circumstance. Cleanliness was no longer ritual, nor comfort. It was clarity, even if it came only from snowmelt water poured from a bucket over his shoulders. His generals questioned this practice. Why not rest? Why not delegate? Why bother? Marcus did not answer, because he didn't need to. In 180 CE, in the city of Vindobona, modern-day Vienna, Marcus Aurelius grew ill. The illness may have been a resurgence of the Antonine Plague, or a simple infection. The records do not say. What is known is this: he did not return to Rome. He did not call for ceremony. He asked for his writings. He asked for quiet. He was offered warmth, perfumes, a bath. He refused. He asked instead to be left alone with his thoughts and a scribe. Return to yourself. It is within you, he wrote in those final days, that you will find everything. We do not know what his final words were, but Meditations ends with a note on nature. Soon you will be ashes or bones. A mere name, or not even a name. Back in Rome, the Celian Hill bathhouse slowly fell into disuse. Without Marcus, it held no ceremony. Commodus, his son, had little interest in Stoicism. The marble benches went unpolished. The hypocaust grew cold. Steam no longer danced across the apse. But the walls remembered. The stone, the cracks, the faint mosaic lines, each carried the echo of Marcus's footsteps. Of the steam that once softened a philosopher's brow. Of the silence that prepared an emperor to face a crumbling world. Long after his death, visitors would find their way into the now crumbling structure. One anonymous visitor, possibly a student or soldier, carved a single phrase into the wall: "To the one who bathed and bore the world." We often imagine emperors in marble, eternal, unchanging. But Marcus Aurelius lived differently. He lived in ritual, not performance. In repetition, not indulgence. In thought, not applause. He bathed not to escape the world, but to prepare for it. And when that world decayed, through plague, war, and sorrow, he did not abandon his rituals. He let them evolve, shrink, adapt, until even the idea of steam could warm him. In that, we find something rare. Not just a philosopher king, but a man who held himself together, not through might, but through mindfulness. What habits will you carry when the world turns against you? When comfort fails, and routine is all you have, will you, like Marcus, still find meaning in the quiet repetition of preparation? Perhaps the warm bath is not the luxury. Perhaps the discipline to return to it, over and over, is the true wealth of a life well lived. The ink was still wet. Across the stone desk in a sun-washed administrative room in Ostia, the bustling port city at the mouth of the Tiber River, a scribe slowly rolled up a papyrus scroll, carefully avoiding the smudged corner where a single miswritten numeral had been scratched out and replaced. It was early in the reign of Emperor Trajan, around 100 CE, and while many remember him for his conquests, his roads, and his statues, very few remember this: the quiet empire of grain ledgers, harbor receipts, and dockside registers, the pulsing logistical heart of Rome. Rome did not starve under Trajan. It was fed, regularly, predictably, and that had very little to do with soldiers or senators. It had everything to do with dockets. This is the story of how one of Rome's most expansive emperors secured loyalty, growth, and peace, not by war, but by perfecting the most boring part of empire, the food supply. At its peak, Rome required over 200,000 tons of grain per year to feed its population. And that was just the capital. The grain came primarily from Egypt, Sicily, and North Africa. It was harvested in the provinces, packed in sacks, loaded into ships, transported across stormy seas, and finally unloaded at the port of Ostia, where it was logged, measured, taxed, and stored. One delay in shipping, one poorly timed storm, one mismanaged dock manifest, and bread riots erupted in the Forum. Emperors had fallen for less. Trajan knew this, and though he was a general by training, he understood that the true battlefield was paperwork. The grain dockets, those dry, cramped scrolls detailing weights, times, routes, and crew counts, were sacred. Every morning, dozens of scribes logged and reviewed them under the arches of Ostia's granary offices. Each docket was numbered, stamped with the seal of the Annona, the imperial grain office, and often marked in two colors: red for urgency, black for standard. A sample entry: Dock 3, ship Livia Augusta from Alexandria. Arrival: calends of September. Grain: 4,650 modii. Delay: none. Crew: 12. Condition: good. This was not glorious. But this was how empires survived. Trajan, born in Hispania and raised in the military, had little patience for theatrical leadership. Unlike Nero or Domitian before him, he rarely performed for the crowds. He visited provinces. He walked construction sites. He read the ledgers himself. It's said that during his first years as emperor, he insisted on receiving a weekly grain report, summarizing deliveries, spoilage, thefts, and surplus. These weren't summaries prepared for ceremony. They were practical. Numbers, margins, short notes in the margins like 3 sacks split on road, patch wagons, flooding at Puteoli dock, suggested rerouting through Terracina. He often replied directly to these scrolls, sometimes in his own hand. Trajan saw governance as a form of maintenance. Grand projects? Yes, but they meant nothing without stable supply chains. Within the grain warehouses, Horia, at Ostia and further inland in Rome's Horia Galbae, specialized rooms existed for just one purpose: scroll management. These were not libraries. They were storage facilities for data, shipping schedules, vessel records, field yield estimates, monthly consumption averages. The room smelled of ink and old reed paper. Scribes worked seated at long benches, marking charts and comparing deliveries with actual sack counts. For every delivery ship, there were a cargo docket, listing goods and weights, a port docket, verifying arrival and time, a receipt docket, confirming handover to warehouse, a taxation docket, recording deductions for imperial levy. Each was cross-referenced against monthly consumption forecasts, many of which were calculated using multi-year rolling averages of grain use. Modern bureaucracies might envy such thoroughness. And this wasn't just for show. Rome's survival, its internal peace, depended on this boring precision. Trajan inherited, and later expanded, the cura annoni, the system of providing free or subsidized grain to Roman citizens. Originally begun during the Republic and reformed by Augustus, it ensured that qualifying citizens received a monthly grain allotment. By Trajan's time, over 150,000 heads of households depended on it. Each recipient had a grain token, a stamped tessera, often made of lead or bronze. These were presented at distribution centers where names were checked against public rosters. No token, no grain. The rosters were updated regularly, purged of deceased recipients, and corrected for fraud. Inspectors, known as distributors, reviewed names, often comparing tokens with citizen registration scrolls maintained in regional archives. Trajan's reform was simple. He demanded accuracy. He funded the hiring of more scribes, increased oversight from equestrian administrators, and introduced regular audits of the roster scrolls. These reviews were done in dusty annexes, under oil lamp light, by overworked scribes hunched over stacked dockets. It was, by all accounts, deeply dull, and yet, hunger disappeared from Rome's streets. Trajan's interest in grain was not purely humanitarian. He understood the politics of food. When grain flowed, the people were calm. When dockets aligned with deliveries, the Praetorian Guard remained quiet. When the warehouses were full, the Senate cooperated. Thus, the bureaucracy became a tool not only of logistics, but of loyalty. In one notable letter preserved in the Pliny-Trajan correspondence, Pliny, then governor of Bithynia, asks about local grain scarcity. Trajan replies with instructions for emergency routing, referencing 3 specific port options and even referencing a surplus ship logged 2 months prior. He remembered the docket. He remembered the number. It is easy to overlook them. They had no statues, no coinage, no triumphs. But the scribes of Trajan's grain system were the unseen machinery of empire. Many worked 12 hours a day, reviewing shipments and updating ledgers. Some specialized in Alexandrian cargoes, others in Tunisian yield estimates. One named Marcus Faventinus even created a method for projecting spoilage loss during humid months, recorded in marginalia on a grain docket from 103 CE. Their writing was small, tight, and legible. Mistakes were fined. Promotions rare. But their accuracy fed a city of 1 million. So what happens when an empire's success depends not on warriors or orators, but on men with ink-stained fingers, counting sacks of grain in a windowless room? What kind of power is that? And what happens when it's forgotten? The midday sun beat down on the port of Ostia, but the granary clerks did not slow. In the dry shadow of Horia Epigathiana, a young scribe counted sacks. 1, 2, 3, each noted with a light stroke of his stylus on a wax tablet bound in wood. Behind him, a tallyman from Africa Proconsularis argued quietly with the dock's supervisor. The ship's cargo, wheat from the estate of a Berber landholder, was logged at 7,400 modii, but the scales in Ostia showed 7,260. The difference, 140 modii, roughly enough grain to feed 1,000 people for a week. The solution? Pull the docket. Inside the warehouse office, under layers of dust and ink, that docket waited, rolled, tied, and filed under the ship's name. The numbers were checked, the scribes consulted, and a single drop of wax sealed the amendment on the side margin. No sword was drawn. No laws rewritten. Just numbers corrected. And the empire moved on. When people recall the reign of Trajan, they tend to speak of Dacia, his great conquest north of the Danube, or of Trajan's column, with its spiral frieze of military might. But the real legacy of his rule is buried in storage rooms, scrawled on shipping scrolls and administrative orders. What Trajan understood, more than perhaps any emperor before him, was this: a state does not survive by strength alone. It survives by being predictable. Predictability in grain supply meant predictability in taxation, labor, urban growth, and civil peace. It meant that families could bake bread every week, that bakers could count on deliveries, that soldiers at the border forts wouldn't mutiny from hunger. In 104 CE, a small crisis emerged in the form of late monsoons in Egypt. The Nile floods, which irrigated the grain-producing heart of the empire, came late and weak. Yields dropped. Trajan's response? He didn't panic. He didn't blame the gods. He sent a memo. A surviving inscription found in Alexandria reads, "By order of Caesar Trajan, grain stores to be rationed to 90 distribution for 2 months. Additional reserves unlocked from Sicilian vaults. Report spoilage counts by next half moon." It's all there. Calm, numbers, delegation, redistribution. Even in crisis, the system held. Trajan expanded the power and professionalism of one key office, the procurator Anoni, the official responsible for managing the empire's grain supply. Though established during the reign of Augustus, the position had grown in importance. By Trajan's era, it functioned like a minister of food and logistics. Under Trajan, the procurator had access to updated yield projections from Egypt, Sicily, and North Africa, monthly arrival schedules from Alexandria, emergency shipment rerouting authority, auditing power over warehouse officials, oversight of local distribution rosters in Rome. All of this was tracked, not by memory or messengers, but by dockets, each sealed, time-stamped, and stored. Many were made of papyrus, some of parchment, others scratched onto wooden tablets for temporary use. And Trajan reviewed them. Maybe not all, but more than any emperor had before. His personal notes appear in several preserved fragments, usually in brief annotations. Delay acceptable. Maintain rations. Monitor monthly intake. Loss too great. Investigate by Decianus. Approved. See docket 122, B for earlier yield comparison. This wasn't micromanagement. It was trust management. We rarely imagine Roman bureaucrats as heroic. But in Trajan's Rome, they were. A lost delivery meant panic. A miscount could spark riots. A backlog at the Ostia port could cascade into weeks of missed rations. And so the scribe, hunched in a dim room lit by oil lamps, hunched over his desk and did the math. One such scribe, Lucius Petronius Bassus, kept his own log, fragments of which survive in the form of reused parchment found in a later binding. His notes include entries like corrected tax entry for Vibius Claudius, declared 120 modii, actual delivery 112. Docket 109.3 amended. Night storm damaged bay doors. For sacks wet. Estimated loss 60 modii. Not thrilling, not poetic, but it meant that the people of Rome ate. It meant that bakers opened shop, that infants drank grain porridge, that temples could distribute loaves to the poor, all because someone ran the numbers correctly. The Horia Galbae, Rome's most important grain storage complex, was immense. Over 140 rooms, organized into sectors, labeled by shipment type and origin. It lay near the Tiber, connected by roads and cartways to the Forum and the Campus Martius. Trajan ordered parts of it renovated, expanded, and resealed for better moisture control. It was not glamorous work. But he insisted on inspection schedules, rodent control, and stone flooring gradients to encourage drainage. Why? Because a single rotten grain pile could spark mold. Mold could infect an entire warehouse, and that could spiral into famine. The Annona did not gamble. Under Trajan, the Horia became temples of arithmetic and airflow. Their stability was praised even in senatorial orations, dry remarks, but full of respect. Trajan didn't just fund logistics. He appeared at them. A wax tablet found at Portus, Rome's man-made harbor, notes the arrival of the emperor to inspect the harbor locks during a grain offloading. The divine Trajan came on the third day before the nones. Walked the pier. Questioned the foreman. Approved Dock 7 renovations. Witnesses were surprised. He did not arrive with trumpets or fanfare. He asked practical questions. Were sacks splitting in the sun? Were dockhands rotating shifts correctly? Was there room to expand crane access? This visibility built trust, not just among officials, but among the workers themselves. They saw their emperor cared about their ledgers. In 107 CE, Rome held a public festival, not to celebrate a war, but to celebrate 10 years without a bread shortage. A rare feat bakers paraded. The Annona officials received wreaths, and Trajan gave a brief address, mostly thanking the warehouse laborers and scribes. He didn't mention conquest, only consistency. But what happens to a system so reliant on daily care, once the man who cares is gone? Can a bureaucracy maintain compassion? Can the math of trust endure after its keeper falls silent? By the time Trajan died in 117 CE, the grain docks at Ostia had grown quiet for the day. Scribes stacked the last of the incoming manifests, carefully tying scrolls with flax twine. A warehouse official sealed the final docket with warm wax, impressed it with the Annona's stamp, and placed it on a stone shelf already crowded with nearly identical rolls. No fanfare marked the emperor's passing in that small office. The system moved forward, quietly, as it always had. But beneath that silence, beneath the smell of parchment, grain dust, and river mud, there lingered something else. The knowledge that the system Trajan had protected so carefully now rested in other hands. Trajan's death was not sudden, but it was distant. He passed away in Selinus, in modern-day Turkey, while returning from his campaigns in the east. His adopted son Hadrian succeeded him swiftly and without bloodshed. This smooth transition was no accident. A stable food supply had bought Trajan the loyalty of Rome's poorest, the cooperation of the Senate, and the efficiency of a vast administrative machine. The army admired him not just for victories, but for being a ruler who made things work. And so, even in death, his ledgers continued to breathe. Hadrian inherited the same network of grain routes, warehouse schedules, and ledger systems. But he brought a different philosophy. Where Trajan was expansionist, Hadrian was conservative. Where Trajan read reports and left handwritten notes, Hadrian reorganized categories and centralized records. He believed in standardization. Under his rule, dockets were updated with a new seal design, featuring his likeness. Scribes were retrained, now writing in a more formal, rigid hand. Grain records from outlying provinces were copied and stored in duplicate archives in Rome and Antioch. New grain roads were paved to improve wagon transport from port to granary, reducing delays during flood season. Hadrian respected what Trajan had built, but where Trajan had trusted people, Hadrian trusted structure. The system became harder to corrupt, but also more impersonal. One of Trajan's former lead scribes, Petronius Bassus, whom we met earlier, did not adjust well to the new regime. He retired in 120 CE, citing rheumatism and deterioration of sight. But before he left, he wrote a letter to his junior scribe, discovered centuries later among a cache of water-damaged tablets. In it, he reflected, "We served not the grain, but the people who waited for it." I worry that the scrolls now serve themselves. It was a quiet fear that the bureaucracy, once a tool for justice and nourishment, might become just bureaucracy. Over time, the Annona became a tool not only of sustenance, but of social engineering. Later emperors used the grain dole to curry favor, to punish disloyal districts, or to boost popularity before public appearances. Some examples: Septimius Severus reduced the ration temporarily after Senate criticism, blaming it on dock irregularities. Aurelian replaced raw grain distribution with pre-baked bread, more popular, but harder to trace in quantity. Diocletian introduced price controls after inflation, tying grain distribution to wage enforcement. Trajan's elegant system, grounded in trust, consistency, and human observation, was becoming a machine of political calculus. The numbers were still added, but now they answered to different questions. As the 3rd and 4th centuries wore on, grain dockets began to disappear from the archaeological record. Papyrus became more expensive. Scribes were overworked. Some ledgers were never copied. Others burned in local revolts or warehouse fires. By the time Rome was sacked in 410 CE, only a fraction of the once flawless supply system remained. The Horia, once pristine, humming with counting and weighing, stood partly abandoned. Rats and rot did what armies could not. Rome's population had declined dramatically. The grain ships slowed, then stopped. In the end, it wasn't violence that ended Rome's bread. It was neglect. The ink dried, the scribes died, and no one trained their replacements. Today, most surviving grain dockets are fragments, charred corners, half-rolled papyri, wax tablets with just a few words scratched into their surface. Dock 12, delayed. 3 modii missing, marked for Lucius. See list. These fragments tell us more than heroic speeches ever could. They tell us that empire was not sustained by charisma or conquest, but by people doing small, correct things every day for decades. Trajan's legacy was not etched in marble. It was scratched into wax. It is easy to forget the systems that keep us fed, easy to overlook the hands that move sacks, that weigh shipments, that count and recount until the numbers match. But Rome remembered while it lasted. And Trajan, the general turned bureaucrat, understood something few rulers ever do, that a steady ledger is mightier than a sword when feeding a million mouths. The corridors of the Palladium, the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill, were unusually quiet in the early hours. Bronze lamps cast flickering shadows across colonnades and marble busts. A muffled cough echoed from a distant chamber, followed by the rustle of parchment being unrolled. Outside, Rome yawned into another day. But deep inside the palace, in a windowless chamber beneath the emperor's study, a small army was already at work. These were the palace clerks, dozens of them, hunched over wax tablets and scrolls, copying, indexing, translating, and reviewing documents, some trivial, some life-changing. The man who demanded such order, such incessant record-keeping, such unrelenting documentation, was Emperor Claudius. Often ridiculed by his contemporaries for his awkward speech, limp, and supposed dullness, Claudius, Rome's fourth emperor, was not a man of spectacle. He was a man of paper, of process, of precedent, and in his quiet, meticulous obsession with administration, he built a model of imperial governance that outlasted his name. When Tiberius Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus ascended to the throne in 41 CE, no one expected it. He had spent most of his adult life in the background, considered weak, awkward, or even simple-minded. Historians like Suetonius and Tacitus mock him. But modern assessments paint a different picture. Claudius was cautious, curious, and deeply bureaucratic. He was a historian before he was an emperor, fluent in Greek, obsessed with antiquarian detail. And when fate placed him on the throne, after the assassination of Caligula, he didn't rule with flair. He ruled with forms. Claudius inherited a bloated, corrupt administrative system, one that was still transitioning from republic to empire. Senators jockeyed for influence. Freedmen, former slaves turned administrators, quietly managed the books. And imperial decrees often conflicted with local customs. Claudius's response? He centralized everything. He expanded the role of palace clerks, particularly imperial freedmen, into powerful managerial positions. Among them, Narcissus, his chief secretary and head of correspondence. Pallas, his treasury overseer. Callistus, his advisor on petitions and legal matters. Felix, appointed governor of Judea, a rare elevation for a freedman. These men were not noble, but they were organized. They controlled scrolls, not swords, and they made Rome run. At the heart of Claudius's administration was a secured office complex beneath the palace, the chamber of the scribi. Here, palace clerks logged legal petitions, copied senatorial decrees, translated provincial letters from Greek, Aramaic, or Egyptian, maintained grain and water distribution records, drafted imperial edicts in the emperor's tone. The space was lit by oil lamps suspended from iron hooks. Walls were lined with cubby holes, each holding scrolls labeled with wax tags. Dust was swept daily. Styluses were sharpened with pumice. Ink was prepared fresh each morning from soot and vinegar. Each clerk specialized, some in property disputes, others in municipal grants, others in census records. Claudius visited regularly. He read random entries. He corrected Latin syntax. He made notes in the margins. It said he once reprimanded a clerk for inconsistent column spacing, not for the error, but because it interrupted reading rhythm. Claudius's obsession with record-keeping had purpose. He believed governance without evidence was tyranny, and so he insisted that every legal judgment be written down, every petition be reviewed by a clerk before being seen by him, all imperial responses be copied into multiple archives, one in Rome, one in the regional office, and one in the palace. He reintroduced public display of legal edicts, carved in bronze or stone and mounted in forums, so that common citizens could know the laws. One surviving inscription from 47 CE, known as the Tabula Claudiana, includes, "Let there be no confusion in my rulings. Let them be available to all who live under the peace of Rome." His reign, unlike others, left paper trails. Claudius also resumed the census, a task neglected since Augustus. The palace scribes coordinated with regional governors to compile property data, population counts, livestock inventories, and tax ledgers. The reports flowed in from Gaul, Africa, Syria, and Britannia. One scroll, partially preserved, lists the grain capacity of a Gaulish farming village, down to the last amphora. Claudius read it. He wrote next to it, "If capacity exceeds 400 amphorae, consider new road to reduce transport time." Not dramatic, not glorious, but effective. Claudius's interest in administration extended to language. Rome was multilingual. and he believed that governance must reflect this. He expanded the Imperial Archives Translation Division. Greek was standard, but he ordered the inclusion of Punic for North African correspondence, Aramaic, used widely in Judea and Syria, Egyptian Demotic, for older provincial contracts. He even attempted to reform the Latin alphabet, introducing 3 new letters, including one to distinguish between certain consonant sounds. The letters did not survive beyond his reign, but the attempt shows his mindset. Not empire by culture, empire by clarity. What was it like to be one of Claudius's clerks? Hours were long. Errors were punished. Promotions slow. But there was purpose. One clerk, Sextus Caecilius Clemens, left behind a personal wax tablet found in a private estate in Latium. The note reads, "Petition completed. 2 copies filed." The Emperor's margin note requested clarification on the second clause. "I must rephrase tomorrow. It's unsigned, unsent. Likely never intended for anyone else. But in it, we hear the quiet rhythm of work, of a mind tethered to detail, of a bureaucrat doing his best." But can precision replace justice? Can scrolls stand in for compassion? When law becomes only process, who ensures the emperor still sees the people beyond the paper? The sun never reached the inner chambers of the Palladium's administrative wing. It was always dim, always quiet. And yet the work never stopped. Inside, the clerks of Claudius scratched away at wax tablets, dry papyri, and scraps of parchment. They did not wear togas or tunics dyed in imperial purple. Most wore simple gray linen, stained with ink and pressed thin from the long wooden benches they sat on. Claudius called them his memory. He, the emperor, possessed the power to issue laws, to hear appeals, to command armies. But he could do none of those things well if he couldn't remember. And so, the clerks did that for him, line by line, day by day. This was not grand governance. It was the dull repetition of empire. While other emperors amused themselves with chariot races or theater, Claudius read reports. Daily. One account from the freedman Narcissus, his correspondence secretary, noted, "The Caesar awoke before first light." Before his meal, he had reviewed 4 petitions, 2 tax audits, and the names of 6 governors' replacements. He did not skim. He annotated. Documents came back with corrections in red ink. Rephrase this law. It contradicts Statute 7 from Hispania. Petitioner's family name misspelled. Check the census scroll. Unclear language. Rewrite in simpler Latin. It is said he once sent a clerk back to rewrite a full decree because the syntax was inelegant. This might seem trivial, but Claudius believed that law was only just if it could be understood. In 45 CE, a minor legal dispute emerged between 2 towns in Gallia Narbonensis. Each claimed ownership of a boundary grove where valuable trees were harvested for timber. Most emperors would have sent a legate to decide. Claudius asked for the original Roman land grants, archived in bronze engravings, any previous rulings from Augustus's era, the harvest tax records from the past decade, a copy of each town's local laws translated from Celtic Latin dialect. The scrolls took weeks to arrive. When they did, clerks compared the texts, analyzed grammar, checked for forgeries, and issued notes. Claudius read them all. His final ruling: the land belongs to neither. Declare it common for seasonal use under imperial oversight. Assign 1 clerk to update both rosters. No speeches, no trials, just evidence-based justice. Claudius made one critical change to imperial administration that most historians overlook. He institutionalized filing. Before him, records were kept, but irregularly. Some laws were written on stone, others passed by word of mouth. Scrolls could be misplaced, uncopied, or held privately. Claudius ordered all imperial edicts to be filed by topic: land, tax, military, citizenship. Each scroll to be copied twice. One for palace use, one for the tabularium, state archive. Clerks to use standard script and date format. Each incoming petition to be logged in a daily journal, with names, topics, outcomes. These may seem like bureaucratic footnotes, but they laid the groundwork for centuries of imperial administration. Rome became not just a city of laws, but a city of records. As Claudius delegated more power to his freedmen, a quiet shift occurred. The clerks, once mere copyists, became gatekeepers. They summarized complex petitions. They highlighted key passages for the emperor. They flagged inconsistencies. In time, they began drafting policy themselves, with Claudius simply reviewing and approving. One example is the extension of Latin rights to cities in Gaul. Pallas and others compiled reports on town populations, trade output, and legal customs. They proposed standardized criteria for expanding Latin status, something Augustus had hesitated to do. Claudius approved it. The policy allowed local leaders to gain citizenship if they adopted Roman legal forms, boosting loyalty across provinces. It wasn't conquest. It was administrative assimilation. But this concentration of power had risks. Some senators despised the freedmen. They believed Rome was being ruled by slaves with pens. Accusations of bribery and favoritism surfaced. The Senate began bypassing the palace entirely, writing edicts meant to counter Claudius's reforms. Tensions rose. Claudius, predictably, responded with a memo. He ordered the Senate clerks to standardize all legal documents and copy them to the palace, so no decrees could contradict existing imperial law. His justification was simple. Let confusion be ended with clarity. Let contradiction dissolve in record. But behind this logic was an anxiety that the scrolls could no longer contain the empire. Not all was paper and ink. Within the scrolls were real people, petitioners, families, laborers. The clerks often saw them first. One story survives of a widow, Valeria Mutia, who brought a dispute over her husband's burial plot. The local official refused to release the land. She appealed. The petition was long, poorly written, scribbled on reused parchment. The clerk reviewing it, Tiberius Pollio, a second-tier assistant, paused. He wrote a note in the margin. Woman writes from desperation. Cannot pay fee, but claim appears truthful. The petition made its way upward. The emperor read it. He approved the land return. Small justice, but not small to her. Yet what happens when the scrolls multiply beyond reading? When the weight of paper grows heavier than the will to review it? Can even a meticulous emperor govern through words alone? The halls of the Palladium grew heavier with scrolls. By the end of Claudius's reign in 54 CE, the filing rooms overflowed. Cabinets were stuffed, cubbyholes brimming. Dust settled on duplicate scrolls that no one had opened in weeks. The emperor, aging and increasingly isolated, still read what he could. But the system he had built, the system of clerks, files, annotations, and careful control, was beginning to fray under the weight of its own success. When you organize everything, you must also remember where you put it all. And what happens when the one who remembers is no longer there? Claudius had ruled for 13 years. Years marked by administrative reform, legal codification, and the rise of a class of imperial freedmen who understood the empire better than many senators. Even in his final months, Claudius reviewed reports. One note, believed to be from his last year, comments on an issue with duplicate citizenship claims in Dalmatia. Two men claim identical lineage to a magistrate in Salona. Neither can produce original property seals. Suspend both claims. Clarify inheritance rights in next census. It wasn't a grand decision. It wasn't about war or diplomacy. It was about property seals. But that was Claudius. He governed not in gold or marble, but in margins. Claudius's death, like so much in Roman imperial history, is shadowed in suspicion. Ancient sources, especially Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio, suggest that his wife Agrippina the Younger poisoned him to ensure her son, Nero, would ascend to the throne. Whether true or not, one thing is certain: the bureaucracy changed. Nero was not a man of scrolls. He was a performer, a speaker, a public figure. He allowed many of the clerical processes to continue, but his interest in them was minimal. He replaced or ignored many of Claudius's trusted freedmen. Narcissus, his chief secretary, was executed. Pallas was dismissed. The palace clerks remained, but they had lost their reader. In the years following Claudius's death, the clerk system slowly lost its soul. Petitions continued to arrive. Reports were still copied and filed. Census scrolls were updated. Translations were made, but there were fewer annotations, fewer marginalia, fewer decisions made on the strength of a single, well-written sentence. The scrolls piled up. Some clerks, once valued advisors, found themselves relegated to silent roles. One tablet, found in the remains of a clerk's quarters, reads simply, No reply. Second review not read. It sits where the others sit. The empire was still functioning. Roads were built. Taxes collected. Laws enforced. But something had shifted. By the end of Nero's reign, many of Claudius's original administrative innovations had been diluted. The chamber of the scribae was still staffed, but now mostly managed local matters, property transfers, tax disputes, census processing. Major legal decisions moved back to the Senate, or to favored advisors who did not rely on paperwork. Claudius's system had been efficient, but it was also personal. He had read the scrolls, questioned them, cross-referenced them, lived with them. Without him, the scrolls became furniture. And yet, traces remain. In one fragment, found centuries later beneath the Basilica of Maxentius, a scroll titled Petitions Regarding Water Allotment in Region 9 survives with the note, seen by Caesar Claudius personally, reviewed with satisfaction. We don't know the outcome. We don't know if the issue was resolved. But we know that an emperor, one mocked for his limp, his stutter, his caution, read it. He saw. In a world of conquests and spectacles, Claudius ruled with quiet certainty. He did not command by charisma, nor inspire by force. He wrote. He filed. He read. He turned the machinery of Rome into something that could be understood, indexed, navigated. For a time, his clerks were the nervous system of empire. But no system lasts without someone to care for it, without someone willing to turn the page. We remember emperors for their victories, for their buildings, for their endings. But what of those who left behind records? Who shaped the world not with legions, but with lines of ink? And what happens to the machine when the only one who read the scrolls is gone? It was a cool spring morning in the year 73 CE, and across the Italian countryside, scribes were already walking. Their sandals stirred dust on cobbled roads, their wax tablets clattered in leather pouches, and at each stop, farmsteads, villas, village fountains, they paused to ask the same dry question. How many live here? What do they own? This was the census. Not the grand, triumphal event Rome is often remembered for. Not a military conquest or a gladiatorial spectacle, but a dusty, dull, necessary ritual, a process of accounting. And behind this wave of scribes and scrolls stood an emperor not known for glamour, nor eloquence, but for pragmatism, Vespasian. This is the story of how a seemingly mundane administrative act, the census of 73 CE, helped rebuild an empire that had nearly torn itself apart. When Vespasian rose to power in 69 CE, Rome was barely holding together. That year, known as the Year of the Four Emperors, had seen civil war, political assassination, and widespread economic instability. The treasury was drained. The provinces were restless. The people were tired. Vespasian, once a general under Claudius and an old soldier of modest origins, inherited not a throne, but a mess. He could have begun with grand monuments or military campaigns. Instead, he began with math. He revived the census, a practice neglected during the chaos of Nero's decline and the brief reigns that followed. He knew that to tax an empire, to feed it, to govern it, you had to know what it was made of, not just the number of citizens, but landholdings, livestock, grain yields, ownership patterns, roads, taverns, shoemakers, bakers, in short, everything. The census under Vespasian was a massive undertaking, structured with cold efficiency. Censors were appointed in every region, trusted men, many from the equestrian class rather than senators, to reduce political interference. These censors sent out local assessors, scribes trained in reading land deeds, estimating property value, and interviewing citizens. Records were compiled in triplicate, one for local use, one sent to Rome, one kept in the regional archive. Each citizen or head of household had to appear before the censor or their delegate and declare number of people in the household, property owned, land, animals, tools, profession, or trade, slave ownership, any previous declarations. To catch discrepancies, to lie was risky, fines could be levied. Repeat offenders could lose privileges. And so, most people told the truth, or at least their version of it. The process was not centralized in marble halls, it happened on the roads. Census officials traveled from town to town, often sleeping in borrowed rooms, recording in the field. One letter, preserved from a census scribe in Lucania, describes the weariness, We walked 12 miles today. Interviewed 4 farmholds. A child died during the visit. They asked if she still counted. I said yes. The census wasn't just about numbers. It was about existence. The poor, the sick, the elderly, those often ignored by the Senate, were now recorded. Counted. Given a line in a ledger. This mattered. It meant roads might reach their villages. It meant tax rates could be adjusted fairly. It meant their lives had weight in imperial Rome. The process was not centralized in marble halls. It happened on the roads. Census officials traveled from town to town, often sleeping in borrowed rooms, recording in the field. One letter, preserved from a census scribe in Lucania, describes the weariness. We walked 12 miles today. Interviewed 4 farmholds. A child died during the visit. They asked if she still counted. I said yes. The census wasn't just about numbers. It was about existence. The poor, the sick, the elderly, those often ignored by the Senate, were now recorded. Counted. Given a line in a ledger. This mattered. It meant roads might reach their villages. It meant tax rates could be adjusted fairly. It meant their lives had weight in imperial Rome. The 73 CE census also had an unexpected social effect. It clarified who was Roman. During the previous decades, records had grown messy. Provincial citizenship grants were inconsistently recorded. Some children of citizens were never officially registered. Veterans retired in regions without proper documentation. The census corrected this. Vespasian issued a decree that any man who served in the legions and had a son should declare the child's name during the census, ensuring their eligibility for citizenship. This led to thousands of updates in the tabulae censorii, the census ledgers kept in Rome. We know from one surviving excerpt, carved into stone in Ephesus, that a man named Lucius Titinius Maro, born to a Syrian auxiliary soldier and a local woman, received formal Roman citizenship by way of this rule. Without the census, he would have remained invisible to the law. Vespasian didn't stop with households. He also ordered a survey of infrastructure. His scribes recorded road conditions, bridge integrity, number of public fountains per region, status of aqueducts, availability of grain storage near ports. It said that Vespasian read these reports while seated on the porch of his modest home, with a blanket over his knees and a cup of watered wine beside him. He'd circle problems in charcoal and draft instructions for governors. One order, found in fragmentary form near Beneventum, states, road segment between Casilinum and Capua unfit for grain carts. Assigned 6 masons. Report repairs. Simple, boring, but vital. The census was not universally loved. Some resented the scrutiny, especially the wealthy who had concealed property. Others feared increased taxation. A few towns resisted by hiding people or falsifying declarations. Vespasian responded with leniency, at first, but repeat offenders were penalized. One scroll from the Archivum Municipale of Terracina records. Publius Sempronius fined for underreporting for mules. Claim 2. Census revealed 6. Assessed at double tax rate. There were no dramatic punishments. Just quiet corrections. It was ordered through paperwork. But when a man's worth is reduced to lines on a wax tablet, what is lost in the counting? Can an empire see its people clearly if it sees only their numbers? The ink had long since dried, but the names endured. Some were scratched into wax, others copied onto papyrus. Some inscribed in stone tablets buried in provincial archives. Most were forgotten. Yet together, they formed the quiet scaffolding of Vespasian's empire. Millions of lives counted, categorized, and calculated. And while Rome's statues bore the faces of gods and emperors, these scrolls, the 73 CE census documents, bore its real foundation: bakers, weavers, mule drivers, potters, millers, and farmers. In this section, we move deeper into the administrative veins of Vespasian's Rome. What was it like to be counted? What happened to the data? How did this dull, expansive documentation shape the future of imperial rule? In a dusty town outside of Tarraco in Hispania, a local scriba, a provincial clerk, set up his folding stool at the town's southern gate. He wore a worn tunic, a woolen sash identifying him as an imperial functionary, and carried 2 wax tablets, a stylus, and a stamped seal block. One by one, citizens and residents approached. Gaius Marius Felix, potter, head of household. 6 persons, 2 slaves, 1 donkey, 3 amphorae of wine in storage. Albinia, widow, no children, 1 goat, 1 loom, no land. Theophrastus, a Greek herbalist from Thessaly, for dependents, 1 rented shop stall, no citizenship. Each name was written down, carefully, with brief notations. The process took minutes. The impact could last generations. This scene played out thousands of times, across provinces, in every region that Rome touched. And when the sun dipped below the horizon, the scribe wiped his tablet, filed the parchment copy, and sealed it with the imperial stamp. The empire grew quieter, but the record remained. Back in Rome, the central bureau that managed census data operated near the Forum, not far from the Temple of Saturn. Here, amid stacks of scrolls and heavy wooden desks, teams of trained clerks worked in rotating shifts to consolidate provincial census rolls, identify irregularities, cross-reference names with existing citizen registries, update the tabula censoria. The master record each day. Bundles of documents arrived from port cities: Massilia, Ostia, Puteoli, Antioch, Alexandria. The scribes did not pause. Errors were marked with a red dot. Duplicates were clipped together with string. Foreign names were copied in transliteration, often mispronounced, but never missed. These records were reviewed monthly by a senior censor, often a man of senatorial rank, though the real power lay with the clerks beneath him. They wielded no swords. But they knew who owed taxes, who owned land, and who claimed citizenship without proof. Vespasian used the census not simply to measure wealth, but to govern with foresight. Some reforms enacted based on the 73 CE census included adjusted military levies. Poorer districts were spared recruitment quotas, while richer towns were expected to fund auxiliary units. Grain distribution modifications. Cities with fewer bakers or milling facilities received additional grain shipments or incentive subsidies for mill construction. New road construction. Traffic records tied to census data showed heavy commercial movement between Apulia and Brundisium. Vespasian ordered a regrading of the Via Appia near Venusia to speed delivery. A few lines on a scroll, and Rome moved. For Vespasian, the census wasn't just economic. It was political. By counting people accurately, he legitimized their presence in the Roman world. This was especially true in the provinces. In North Africa, small Berber communities that had long remained outside the Roman gaze were now visited by scribes. In Syria, Jewish settlements still reeling from the recent revolt were included, their names cautiously noted, some with annotations like subject to tribute but not full census. This inclusion was complicated. To be counted meant you could be taxed, you could be conscripted, you could be documented, but it also meant you had a place. You could petition, you could be known. Not everyone welcomed the scribes. Some wealthy elites, particularly in Gaul and parts of Egypt, attempted to underreport holdings or disguise slave ownership. In the eastern provinces, a few towns simply closed their gates to the assessors, citing religious autonomy or local custom. Vespasian, practical as ever, did not respond with legions. He sent inspectors. Their reports were terse. Men of Petra declare land barren, but olive groves in use. Estimated tax loss, for 100 denarii. Recommend corrective fine. Town of Lemovices denied entry. Census clerks rerouted. Governor issued warning, fine levied. Compliance restored. Again, no theatrics. Just paper and penalties. The empire worked because non-compliance was not dramatic. It was tedious. In war-touched regions like Judea and parts of Germania, the census included grim entries. 23 homes, but only 12 families remain. War loss presumed. Fields fallow. Owners missing. No declarations since 70 CE. These lines mattered. They determined land redistribution. They shaped tax projections. They informed decisions about rebuilding or abandoning a region. The census wasn't just about who lived. It was about who no longer did. The final tallies from the 73 CE census are lost to time, but ancient estimates suggest Vespasian's scribes counted over 6 million people across the empire. Each entry, whether carved into wood or curled onto papyrus, represented a choice: to govern not by fear, but by form; to rule not by edict, but by evidence. Yet when governance becomes paper, can the ink still bleed? If rule depends on numbers, What happens when those numbers stop reflecting reality? Can an empire still see its people when the scrolls begin to lie? The census was complete. Scrolls had been sealed and carted back to Rome, their wax imprints still soft. Ledgers had been copied, records filed, summaries delivered to the aediles, censors, and even Vespasian himself. The names, millions of them, rested in the quiet dark of imperial archives. No bells rang. No statues were raised. But something important had happened. The empire now knew itself, again. And yet, for all its breadth, for all its lines of ink and columns of grain tallies, the 73 AD census also revealed something more subtle, more human, the limits of counting. The bureaucratic network Vespasian assembled after the census was sophisticated, even by modern standards. Tabulae censorii, census registers organized by region, then by town, with names listed alphabetically when possible. Tax schedules, tied to household income and occupation, based on profession codes updated every 5 years. Civic rosters, separate from census rolls, detailing public roles, local officials, and council participants. Veteran settlement ledgers, mapping land grants given to retired soldiers, including boundary disputes and water rights. These scrolls did not sit idle. They were referenced for legal disputes, queried for military recruitment, and audited for tax reforms. One wax tablet from Gaul includes a directive from a local magistrate. Compare current census list with the water use petitions. If any name appears in both without property listing, flag as fraudulent. This wasn't abstract governance. It was hands-on. But even Vespasian understood, not all of Rome could be written down. No matter how thorough, the census had blind spots. Women were often recorded only in relation to a male head of household. Children, especially orphans or those outside formal households, were inconsistently counted. Freedmen were documented, but rarely with past records, just their new names and occupations. Transient workers, such as seasonal harvesters, fell between towns and into obscurity. Enslaved people, while counted as property, were not named. One census report from Cappadocia states, 43 souls, 28 are slaves. No further declaration. In another, a clerk scrawled in the margin, child at gate asked if he would be counted. No answer prepared. For all its reach, the census counted what Rome considered worth counting. Vespasian died in 79 CE, 6 years after the Great Census. On his deathbed, according to Suetonius, he joked, "V. puto deus fio." Alas, I think I'm becoming a god. But before he died, he reviewed one last set of scrolls. It was a summary report, compiled by his staff, detailing the financial and demographic condition of the empire as of that year. Population. Approximately 60 million across all provinces. Tax revenues stabilized at pre-Neronian levels. Grain surpluses in North Africa offset deficits. In Egypt, legal petitions tied to census corrections dropped 40 since 73 CE. One line, perhaps apocryphal, claims he wrote in the margin, "They eat. They pay. They obey." Let that be enough. It was cold, but not cruel. He ruled not through love, but through function. After Vespasian, his son Titus took the throne, followed soon by Domitian. The census continued, periodically, if less rigorously. Some reforms were reversed, others persisted. But what remained constant was the belief that counting meant control, and control meant survival. Scrolls became maps of reality, or at least, the empire's version of it. By the 4th century, the Roman Empire was fracturing. Civil wars, economic crises, external pressures from Germanic tribes, Sassanids, and internal dissent. Still, the census endured, though now bloated and slow, choked by its own processes. Officials complained about incomplete returns, delayed updates, contradictory records from overlapping censuses, a growing gap between what was written and what was true. One governor lamented, "The scrolls tell us there are 4,000 men fit for service. I found only 900. The rest are names without bodies." For all its scale, the census could not measure hope, fear, resentment, belonging. It could not track faith as Christianity spread in shadows. It did not count the songs of traders, the grudges of farmers, or the whispers of revolt in border towns. It knew the price of wool, but not the bitterness of a widow taxed beyond her means. The census saw subjects, not citizens. Assets, not stories. In 73 CE, Vespasian restored order not with triumphs, but with columns of numbers. His census tamed chaos with scrolls and styluses. It reminded the empire who it ruled and how. But for all its structure, for all its legibility, even the most precise census cannot capture what holds a society together. That lies between the lines, in the unrecorded, in the human, in the forgotten. The palace corridors were polished to silence. Bronze doors gleamed, but were rarely touched. Guards stood stiff in alcoves, their armor neither clanking nor shifting. And at the far end of the marble hall, past columns draped in shadow and gold, sat a single desk. It was immaculately clean. Atop it, a wax tablet, a stylus, a small sand clock, and a meticulously folded list. Every morning, Emperor Domitian would enter this room, alone, at precisely the 6th hour, take his seat behind the desk, and begin his day, not with grand speeches or council meetings, but with a list. He would read the entries aloud, one by one, slowly, as if hearing them gave them weight. Then he would add to it 2 or 3 new lines, often menial, sometimes cryptic. Inspect marble dusting in Senate vestibule. Recalibrate sundial in private garden. Replace steward for lateness. Record details. This was not eccentricity. This was Domitian's governance. When Domitian became emperor in 81 CE, following the sudden death of his older brother Titus, the empire sighed, uncertain. Domitian was the last son of the Flavian dynasty, the youngest, and perhaps the most underestimated. For much of his youth, he was kept to the side of public life while his father, Vespasian, and brother ruled. His early political career was modest, his public persona cautious. But in private, Domitian kept notebooks. He tracked public officials' appointments, grain prices, temple restoration reports, and the names of palace staff who lingered too long during transitions. His first official act as emperor, recorded in the archives, was a quiet reorganization of the imperial schedule. He believed chaos entered where routine was absent. Domitian ruled from lists. His diary, now lost but partially reconstructed through contemporaries like Suetonius and Pliny the Younger, was not a memoir. It was a working ledger. Each day included administrative actions, who was promoted, demoted, fined, praised. Senatorial notes, who attended, who was late, who disagreed. Building reports, stone ordered, construction delays, material costs. Behavioral observations, comments on staff demeanor, loyalty. A surviving line from a report compiled by a freedman named Clodenus reads, Emperor noted that Cornelius Aruntius yawned during public oration. Entry made in daily record. To be watched. For Domitian, everything mattered. A yawn was not mere fatigue, it was an indicator, a sign that someone was not aligned with the machinery of the state. The diary became a kind of mirror, not just of the empire, but of his fears. Domitian employed a special class of scribes, personal diarists, who followed him throughout the palace with tablets and scrolls. Their job? To record, without judgment, every spoken order, observation, or request. They filed copies into the emperor's personal archive and returned updated versions each evening. It said he reviewed these entries in bed, marking them with colored cords, red for urgent, black for disciplinary, green for items to follow up next week. No cord meant it was satisfactory, and complete. The scribes lived in an annex wing. They were rotated monthly, so none became too familiar. Domitian disliked familiarity. One former scribe, quoted in an early 2nd century letter, recalled, "He never called me by name. Only scribe, but he knew my handwriting. Corrected it once. Said it had grown lazy." More than any previous emperor, Domitian believed in ritualized control. His personal habits mirrored his governance. He dined alone, often in silence, noting what food was served and who prepared it. He bathed at the same hour daily, preferring lukewarm water, checked first by a taster. He walked his garden paths in precise order, left turn first, never right. Even his legislation followed this rhythm. He issued decrees on the height of garden hedges in urban villas, the acceptable hour for bathing in public thermae, the shape and proportion of theater, seating. None of these rules were popular, but they made the empire predictable. Predictability, though, brings its own peril. Senators began to feel stifled. Military commanders, though well paid, found themselves monitored too closely. Petitions were reviewed not for content, but for formatting. One famous rejection reads, "Petition not accepted. Margins uneven. Resubmit." This obsession with form over substance slowly built resentment. And while the empire remained peaceful on the surface, the cracks beneath grew deeper. Domitian didn't notice. He only saw the scrolls, and the scrolls said things were in order. Domitian's evenings were the most telling. After the palace staff had retired, he often sat alone in his study, rereading that day's entries. Sometimes he would recopy them in his own hand. Sometimes he would write questions in the margins. Was that flinch from fear or disloyalty? Is 10 minutes early still late if they waited to be noticed? Do people who fear me work better, or simply more quietly? These were not the thoughts of a tyrant in full command. They were the thoughts of a man trying to understand the world through routine, to tame human unpredictability with measurement. Among the scattered fragments of Domitian's personal diary, one wax tablet survives in a fragmentary state, burned on one corner, found centuries later buried beneath the Palatine ruins. It is not a decree or official log. It appears to be a personal note, likely never sent. To be surrounded and not known. To be obeyed and not understood. Perhaps I am not emperor, but a function. A list no one reads but me. We do not know what prompted the line, but it reveals the deeper tragedy of Domitian's rule. He believed he could govern away loneliness. If every moment is catalogued, every glance recorded, every decision controlled, does that bring power, or merely the illusion of it? What happens when a man confuses order with loyalty and lists with love? The list began at dawn. It always did. One of Domitian's personal scribes would enter the study quietly, retrieve the previous night's editions, and replace the wax tablet on the desk with a fresh, blank slate. The emperor would arrive shortly thereafter, review the contents of his daily docket, and, in silence, begin reading and rewriting. Each day had a name, a purpose, a rhythm. There were no surprises. But the empire was not built on rhythm alone. Underneath the surface of this controlled environment, tension stirred, not loud, not visible, but persistent. This section explores what happens when a man builds his world around order, not just to govern, but to protect himself from disorder within. By the mid-80 CE, Domitian had turned his personal routine into policy. His obsession with lists, order, and precise observation became the empire's operating principle. The palace scribes weren't the only ones taking notes. Informants, some official, some opportunistic, began submitting reports from across the empire. Senatorial meetings, provincial appointments, temple finances, even conversations in public baths. These accounts were filed in the tabularium, Rome's official record house, but copies were sent directly to Domitian's inner archive, where he personally reviewed many of them. A former urban prefect wrote, he preferred reports in list format. No narrative, just facts, names, actions, times. He trusted nothing but the recorded. But the truth is, he didn't trust the recorded either. He trusted the act of recording. Domitian believed that the act of writing something down gave it permanence, control. If it was documented, it was understood. If it was noted, it was neutralized. Domitian increasingly governed through memoranda. He would issue minor policies and adjustments through short scrolls, many of which bore only his initials and a colored seal indicating urgency. Some examples, recorded in municipal archives, included tax on fishmongers to be increased by 0.5% in port towns, public torch lighting to begin 15 minutes earlier in winter months. All imperial statues must bear correct laurel orientation, inconsistencies to be catalogued. These were not dramatic policies, but they were relentless. Rome began to choke on precision. Local magistrates, afraid to improvise, awaited clarification for every minor issue. Delay became default. Interpretation was dangerous. A governor in Lusitania wrote, "We await instruction on how best to repaint the imperial crest above the baths." Citizens complain, "We cannot act." Domitian replied with an illustration and a measurement specification. Domitian's diary, once a personal routine, became something else entirely, a defense mechanism. He no longer used it simply to track empire-wide affairs. He began logging. who greeted him with what tone of voice, what jokes were told during feasts, which servants lingered longer than necessary, what offerings were left or forgotten. At the imperial altar, he kept score. A dismissed official might not be publicly condemned, but his name would disappear from the diary, a quiet erasure. Others, who pleased or impressed him, would be starred, bracketed, or double underlined. Over time, even his own staff grew anxious. One freedman reportedly asked, "Am I still written down?" Not in jest, but in fear. Nowhere did this culture of control clash more violently than with the Senate. The senators, proud, aristocratic, theatrical, were used to rhetorical debate, political influence, and public presence. Domitian viewed all of that as theater. He preferred results, records, measurable conduct. He rarely appeared in person. Instead, he sent written instructions, sometimes daily, always with expectations clearly spelled out. The Senate resented this, and he resented their resentment. One diary fragment, quoted by Suetonius but likely drawn from a lost court record, includes the line, "They perform speeches for each other, not the state. I file deeds, they rehearse gestures." In response to their resistance, he began compiling secret profiles on individual senators. These were not mere biographies, they were behavioral audits. Who voted which way? Who arrived late? Who changed their opinions mid-session? Despite these growing tensions in Rome, the empire remained stable under Domitian's rule. Roads were maintained, borders were defended, grain shipments flowed. The army was well-fed and well-paid. Domitian made sure of it. His lists included military provisioning tables, fortification plans, and camp sanitation reports. In Germania, he ordered the construction of a line of watchtowers, an early version of the limes, not because he feared an invasion, but because he feared vagueness. The forests were unmeasured, and that, to him, was unacceptable. His general in Moesia, Agricola, complained in a letter that it took longer to report actions to Rome than to execute them. Domitian responded with a template for submitting daily updates. The general obeyed, but he also stopped writing anything that wasn't required. By 90 CE, Domitian was surrounded by a mountain of paper. The palace archives overflowed. His personal diaries spanned dozens of volumes. His secret files, according to later rumors, filled entire rooms. And yet, he seemed no more certain than he had before. In fact, he grew more fearful. He changed scribes frequently. He conducted interviews with staff to confirm tone. He banned gatherings of more than 3 people within palace grounds unless logged in advance. To many, he looked powerful, efficient, iron-willed. But behind the curtain, he was a man terrified of the gaps in his lists. One final fragment, written in a trembling hand believed to be Domitian's own, was found on a discarded wax tablet. "Even if I record it all, they still breathe where I cannot see. What escapes between the entries will be my undoing." When order becomes obsession and records replace relationships, what remains of leadership? Can a man govern with certainty if all his certainty is built on what can be written but never truly known? The scrolls were still in order, each tied with ribbon, labeled, stacked. The entries marched on in straight lines, names, dates, judgments, allocations. Everything accounted for. But by the year 96 CE, the man who had once read them all with such precision had grown weary. The ink was just as dark, the stylus just as sharp, the parchment just as smooth. And yet something had changed. Domitian was tired of the silence his order had built. This is the final section of a story not about a tyrant in the usual sense, nor a visionary in the noble sense, but about a man who mistook control for clarity, and whose diary, once a sanctuary of certainty, became his last remaining voice in a world that no longer responded. Domitian's palace on the Palatine was vast, ornate, symmetrical, by his own architectural standards. He had personally overseen many renovations, down to the geometric ratios of hallway lengths. The rooms were mathematically elegant, the corridors aligned, the gardens were trimmed in perfect circles. But in the last years of his reign, he rarely ventured out of 3 rooms. His study, where his diary was kept, his private dining chamber, where he ate alone, and a small, windowless chamber where he dictated his thoughts, not for others, but for himself. In this last room, he began using wax tablets not to record appointments or decrees, but questions. Questions no one else would ever read. If they follow because they fear, have I led them anywhere? Will the scrolls speak when I am gone? Have I mistaken stillness for peace? These were not diary entries. They were fragments, jottings, scribbled confessions without conclusion. In the final years, Domitian became increasingly ritualistic. He revived old religious practices, declared himself Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. His image appeared on coins with rays around his head. Statues of Minerva, his patron goddess, were installed in every chamber where he worked. He claimed she visited him in dreams. Some said this was ego. Others said it was fear. Perhaps both. He saw in divine ritual the same structure he saw in governance. Rules, roles, response. But the gods gave no answers. On September 18, 96 CE, Domitian was assassinated in a plot that included members of his own household staff. According to ancient sources, the chamberlain Parthenius, along with a freedman and several guards, carried out the killing. It happened quickly, quietly. There were no uprisings, no civil war. The Senate convened and passed a motion to erase his name, damnatio memoriae. His statues were defaced, his name removed from inscriptions, his face scratched from coins. And yet, in the deepest room of the palace, the scrolls remained, tied, unread, still aligned. Centuries later, during excavations near the Palatine's eastern edge, a fragmentary document was uncovered in a sealed clay jar. The parchment had been folded multiple times and tucked behind a collapsed shelf. Most of it was faded, but a few lines survived. Today, I recorded nothing. The silence was the same as before. I wonder if the world is quieter, or if I have only become its echo. The signature, a stylized D. It was never filed, never stamped, likely never meant for eyes other than his own. But it remains one of the few personal pieces ever attributed to Domitian, a man so dedicated to observation that he may have forgotten how to be seen. With Domitian gone, his administrative system collapsed rapidly. His successors, Nerva and then Trajan, sought to distance themselves from his style. His secret files were destroyed. His diary was removed from the palace. The colored cords, wax tablets, and formatting rituals were abandoned. Governance returned to negotiation, debate, and public interaction. Efficiency decreased, but so did fear. Domitian ruled for 15 years, longer than many emperors, and during that time, he revalued the Roman coinage. He rebuilt the Capitoline Temple. He strengthened the northern frontier. He reorganized the grain supply and imperial finances. All of this was real, but what people remembered were the files, the eyes, the quiet paranoia. Not because his policies failed, but because they isolated him. He trusted records, but not relationships. He heard everything, but listened to no one. When leadership becomes a ledger, and life is lived through lists, what part of the human story is left behind? Domitian believed that if he documented everything,